There is a moment and almost nobody witnesses it when it happens, when a man decides to stop. Not to stop living, not to stop caring, not to stop feeling, but to stop talking about what he feels. And what makes this moment so invisible, so thoroughly missed by everyone who loves him, is that it doesn't announce itself. There's no dramatic scene, no breaking point that anyone else can see. There's just a man who, one day, is a little quieter than he used to be, and then a little quieter again, and then quieter still. Until 1 year, 5 years, a decade later, the people around him look up and realize they genuinely cannot remember the last time he told them something real, something that actually cost him something to say. And when they try to understand why, they reach for the simplest explanation available to them. He's always been like that. He's not the type. He's just private. That's just how he is. But here is what I want you to understand before this video goes anywhere else. Those explanations are not wrong because they're mean. They're wrong because they're lazy. They're wrong because they stop the investigation exactly where the investigation needs to begin. They mistake the outcome of a very long psychological process for a personality trait. And in doing so, they let the people who love these men off the hook in a way that those men have never not once been let off the hook themselves. This video is about what actually happened, not the surface explanation, the real one. We are going to go deep, genuinely deep into the psychology, the lived experience, the internal logic that produced this silence. And I am going to ask you to do something uncomfortable, to hold your assumptions aside for the next 23 minutes and actually listen, because these men spent most of their lives not being listened to. The least we can do is start now. The long education of disappointment. The first reason senior men stop talking about their pain is one that sounds simple but is, in psychological terms, one of the most consequential learning processes a human being can go through. It is this: they tried, and it didn't work, and they tried again, and it still didn't work, and they kept trying across years and decades and relationships and contexts, until the evidence became so consistent and so overwhelming that continuing to try would not have been hope. It would have been denial. Psychologists call this extinction, the gradual but permanent disappearance of a behavior when it is consistently not reinforced. You don't need a psychology degree to understand it. You just need to have been a person long enough to know that when something costs you something and gives you nothing in return, you eventually stop doing it. But what makes this particular extinction so significant and so invisible to the people around these men is what the man was actually seeking when he first opened up. He was not looking for solutions. I want to say that again because it is perhaps the most important sentence in this entire video. He was not looking for solutions. He was not asking to be fixed. He was not requesting a list of things he could do differently. He was looking for the experience, the simple, profound, deeply human experience of being genuinely heard, of having another person sit with him in the weight of something difficult and say, without flinching, "I see what you're carrying, and I'm not going anywhere." That's it. That's all he wanted, and what he received instead, almost every time, was something that communicated the opposite of that. Sometimes it was immediate advice. The moment he mentioned something hard, someone was already reaching for a solution, as if the discomfort of sitting with his pain was too much to bear, and the fastest way to end that discomfort was to fix the problem so nobody had to feel it anymore. But that response, however well-intentioned, sent a message he could not unhear. Your pain is a problem to be solved, not an experience to be shared. Sometimes it was minimization. It could be worse. Other people have it harder. At least you have your health. At least you have a roof over your head. All of which may be statistically true and all of which completely miss the point. Minimization doesn't make pain smaller. It just makes the person who is feeling it feel smaller for having it. Sometimes it was the redirect, that quiet, almost imperceptible pivot where the conversation about his pain somehow became a conversation about someone else's pain that was implicitly presented as more legitimate, more urgent, more worthy of the room's attention. And a man who experiences that pivot enough times eventually learns not to start conversations that he already knows will end somewhere he didn't choose to go. And sometimes, and this is the one that left the deepest mark, it was silence. Not the good kind. Not the presence-filled quiet of someone sitting with him in difficulty. But the silence of someone who didn't know what to say, or didn't want to say it, or was so uncomfortable with the rawness of what he'd shared that they went somewhere else inside themselves, and left him standing there with the cost of having opened something that was now open with nowhere to go. Every one of those responses taught him something, and the lesson across all of them was the same. The talking costs. The talking does not pay. Stop talking. And so he did. And I want to be very clear about something. This was not weakness. This was not emotional immaturity or some failure of psychological development. This was a man applying one of the most fundamental principles of rational human behavior: stop investing in what consistently produces no return. We praise that principle in business. We call it wisdom in finance. We celebrate it in strategy. But when a senior man applies it to the disclosure of his own pain, we call it a problem and wonder how to fix it. That tells you more about us than it tells you about him. The socialization that left no exit. The second reason goes further back than any single relationship or any specific moment of disappointment. It goes all the way back to the beginning. Most senior men alive today were raised inside a very specific emotional architecture. An architecture that had one door for emotional expression, a narrow door, carefully guarded, and a vast interior where everything else was expected to be managed privately, silently, and without complaint. Physical pain had some passage through that door, provided it was clearly documented: a broken bone, a visible wound, an injury that could be pointed to and said, "There, that is why I am hurting." Even then, the expectation was that you'd bear it with dignity, that you wouldn't make too much of it. But the other kind of pain, the deeper, quieter, more persistent kind, the pain of loss and loneliness and grief and disappointment, and the accumulated weight of a life lived under constant pressure with very little acknowledgement of the cost of that living, that pain had no door. It didn't have a name. It didn't have a language. The boys who grew up to be these senior men were not given vocabulary for that experience. They were not given permission to express it. They were not given environments that were safe for it. They were given instead a very clear and very consistent message delivered through 1,000 small moments across the entirety of their childhoods. Big boys don't cry. Man up. Don't be sensitive. Shake it off. Don't let them see it get to you. You're fine. And those words, repeated often enough by people with enough authority, did not just shape behavior. They shaped identity. They told a boy who he was supposed to be at the level where selfhood forms. Not just, don't express this, but if you feel this, something is wrong with you. So the pain didn't disappear. Pain never disappears just because you're told not to show it. It went underground. It went into the interior. It found the only place available to it, the private self, and it took up residence there. And over 60 years of reinforcement, that interior residence became so permanent, so familiar, so thoroughly woven into how these men experience themselves, that they can no longer clearly distinguish between who they are and what they were trained to suppress. The silence is not their nature. I want to say that as clearly as I possibly can. The silence is what 60 years of a specific emotional environment produced in people who were never given any other option, and that distinction matters enormously. Because if you believe the silence is who he is, you accept it as a fixed reality and you stop looking for what produced it. But if you understand that the silence is what was done to him slowly, consistently, by a culture that didn't know any better and wouldn't have cared if it did, then you begin to relate to him differently. You begin to ask different questions. You begin to see through the silence to the man who exists behind it, who has always existed behind it, who is not defined by the silence even though he has lived inside it for most of his life. And that seeing, that genuine, non-simplistic, historically informed seeing, is the beginning of actually understanding him. There's something else I need to say here, because it's missed almost universally by the people who care about these men. The emotional socialization these men received was not just about expression. It was about reception. They were not just trained not to show certain emotions. They were trained not to receive them well in others either. Entire generations of men grew up in households where the full expression of emotional complexity was uncomfortable for everyone, men and women alike, where the tools for sitting with somebody in pain were simply not present because nobody had ever modeled them, passed them down, or made them feel safe. So when these men look around for evidence that the world is now different, that the people in their lives now have those tools, what they often find is that the tools have improved but not enough, and not consistently enough, to justify the risk of finding out which category the person in front of them falls into. When openness became a weapon, the third reason is the one that almost nobody considers, and it's the one that, when I explain it, tends to produce the deepest recognition in the men I'm describing. Pain shared in a moment of genuine vulnerability does not always stay in that moment. Sometimes it gets stored, sometimes it resurfaces 3 years later in a conversation about something entirely unrelated, wielded as evidence in an argument that has nothing to do with the original disclosure. Well, you told me yourself that you felt like a failure after that. And there it is, the thing he shared in his most unguarded moment, now turned into ammunition in a context he never anticipated, never consented to, and has no way to retrieve or contain. Sometimes it travels. He told one person in confidence, and that person, not out of malice but out of an ordinary human inability to hold a heavy thing alone, mentioned it to someone else, and then someone else. And then a man discovers that his private interior has somehow become a topic of conversation among people who were never meant to have access to it. He can feel it in the way they look at him, the slight adjustment in how they treat him, the careful pauses that weren't there before, and sometimes perhaps most painfully it becomes a diagnosis. The thing he shared honestly, from a real place of real experience, gets interpreted not as a genuine disclosure but as evidence of some fundamental limitation. His sadness becomes instability, his fear becomes weakness. His honest articulation of loneliness becomes proof that something is wrong with him that he hasn't fully disclosed yet. And a man who has experienced any combination of those outcomes has learned something that no amount of encouragement to open up can simply overwrite. He has learned that vulnerability has a liability, that the people receiving his disclosure do not always have the capacity or the intention to hold it safely, and that once it leaves him, he has no control over what it does in the world. This is not paranoia. This is not the result of emotional damage or psychological dysfunction. This is accurate information gathered through direct, repeated experience. And the decision it produces, the decision to keep the pain where it cannot be used, redirected, misinterpreted, or traveled beyond his control, is not a failure of courage. It is the exercise of hard-won wisdom about what happens when courage meets a world that is not equipped to honor it. I want to pause here because this point deserves more than a quick acknowledgement. We live in a cultural moment where the dominant narrative about men and emotional expression is something like, men need to be more vulnerable, men need to open up, men need to let people in. And there is something true in that. But what that narrative almost never includes is an honest reckoning with what happened the last time these men were vulnerable. What it cost them, what it produced, and why a rational person, having gathered that data across decades of lived experience, might reasonably conclude that the prescription being offered does not account for the reality being lived. When we tell senior men to open up without first asking what happened when they did, we are not helping them. We are asking them to repeat an experiment that already produced its results, and then be surprised when they decline. The identity that silence built the fourth reason moves into different psychological territory, deeper in some ways than anything we've covered so far. For most senior men, the capacity to bear difficulty without displaying its cost was not just a skill. It was not just a behavior. It was the architecture of their identity. Think about what it meant to be a certain kind of man across the decades these men lived through. Think about what was being performed and genuinely embodied when a man showed up to work after a terrible night, when he kept the household stable during a financial crisis, when he didn't flinch at news that terrified him, when he carried his grief privately so that the people around him wouldn't have to carry it with him. That capacity was, in a very real sense, who he was, not what he did. Who he was. And talking about his pain, really talking about it, not the careful, managed version, but the actual weight of what it cost him, threatens that identity at the deepest level, because it implies that the capacity was never absolute, that there were cracks, that the man who appeared unbreakable was in fact bearing something. Now, you and I might look at that and say, of course he was bearing something, that's not a weakness, that's what makes it remarkable. But the man himself is not applying that logic. He is applying a different logic. One that was built into him across decades of identity formation. One that says, if I talk about the cost, I am admitting that I was not, in fact, the man I appeared to be. And if I am not that man, then who have I been for 60 years? That is not a small question. That is the question that reorganizes everything. And most people, when faced with the potential dissolution of the self-concept that has organized their entire life, do not lean into it eagerly. They protect it, quietly, consistently, intelligently. And the protection looks from the outside like stubbornness, or pride, or an unwillingness to be helped. But from the inside it is something much more coherent than that. It is a man doing what every psychologically intact person does when something threatens the core of who they understand themselves to be. He holds the line. The architecture of asymmetry, the fifth reason, is the one that lives in relationships specifically, in the long-term accumulation of what relationships asked of these men versus what they offered in return. Most senior men spent decades inside relationships where they were the emotional regulator, where their role, explicitly or implicitly, was to provide the stability that allowed other people to be unstable, to absorb what the people around them were feeling without letting it move them too visibly, to be the ground that others could walk on without worrying whether the ground would shift. And he did that. He did it for years, for decades, often without being asked and without being thanked, because the doing of it was so thoroughly embedded in the expectation of what he was supposed to be that it was invisible, even to the people who benefited from it most. But here is what that asymmetry produced, slowly and without any single dramatic moment to mark its arrival. He stopped expecting to receive what he gave, not bitterly, not with anger, just quietly, accurately, through the ordinary process of noticing what was available and adjusting his expectations to match the reality. And eventually, he arrived at a very clear and very honest assessment of the emotional landscape he was living in. This relationship is not structured to receive what I actually carry, and asking it to do something it was not built to do will not produce what I need. It will produce friction. It will produce concern. It will cost me the stability that everyone in this house is depending on. And I have already paid too much to risk the one thing everyone needs me to keep providing. So he keeps the pain where it has always lived, inside, where it costs only him. And that only him is worth sitting with for a moment, because embedded in that calculation is something that should break our hearts a little if we're paying attention. He has spent so long prioritizing the emotional needs of everyone around him that the idea of prioritizing his own even privately, even just in conversation, feels not just vulnerable but selfish, disproportionate, an imposition. And a man who has arrived at that conclusion about his own pain has not arrived there because he doesn't value himself. He has arrived there because he was taught consistently, relationally, over a lifetime that his value was in what he provided, not in what he experienced, and the provision never stopped being required. The last room that belongs to him, the sixth reason, is, I think, the most important, and it's the most misunderstood, and it will likely be the most surprising. Senior men don't just stop talking about their pain because the talking produced bad outcomes. They stop talking at a certain point because the silence itself has become something they don't want to give up. Let me explain exactly what I mean. Think about the life of most senior men. Think about how much of that life has been shared, negotiated, performed, managed, made available to other people's responses and judgments and opinions and advice. Think about how many decisions he made that weren't entirely his. How many rooms he was in that weren't entirely his. How many conversations he participated in where what he was actually thinking was not what he was actually saying, because saying it would have been too complicated, too disruptive, too much. In a life that full of shared space, the interior experience of pain became something rare and strange and quietly precious. A space that is entirely his. A place where nobody can enter without permission. Where nobody can redirect or minimize or reference it later or turn it into a conversation about what he should do differently. Where nobody can respond with advice he didn't ask for or concern he doesn't know what to do with. Where nobody can take what he shares and use it in a way he didn't intend. His pain, held privately, is the one room in his life where he is completely and permanently in charge. And protecting that room is not self-destruction. It is not a symptom of anything pathological. It is the exercise of sovereignty, the deep, dignified, fully human need to have some part of your interior life that belongs only to you. We talk about men needing to be more open as if openness is always and automatically superior to privacy. As if the interior life only has value when it's being expressed to another person. As if a man who keeps something for himself is necessarily suffering rather than choosing. But what if, for some men, the privacy is not the wound? What if the privacy is the protection? What if the silence is not the thing that needs to be healed but the thing that's been doing the healing all along? I am not saying that isolation is healthy. I am not saying that connection doesn't matter or that these men don't deserve to be genuinely known. I am saying something more careful than that. I am saying, before you try to take the silence away from him, understand what the silence is doing. Before you work to open the room, understand why he needed it closed. Before you frame his privacy as a problem to be solved, consider that he may have solved a different problem with it, and that solving that problem kept him intact in ways that nothing else could. The most loving thing you can do for a senior man who carries his pain in silence is not to remove the silence. It is to make the space around him so genuinely safe, so free of the consequences that taught him the silence was necessary, that he can choose freely, without cost, on his own timeline what he wants to share and what he wants to keep. That is not fixing him, that is honoring him. And most of these men have waited a very long time to be honored rather than fixed. I want to close with something I need you to actually hear. If this video described a senior man in your life, your father, your husband, your grandfather, your friend, I want you to resist the instinct to immediately. Think about what you're going to do about it. Because that instinct, however loving it is part of what produced the silence in the first place. The impulse to fix. The impulse to respond, the impulse to turn his interior experience into something that requires action from you. Instead, just sit with what you've learned. Sit with the reality that he tried, for years, to tell you things, and the world didn't receive them well enough to keep the door open. Sit with the reality that what looks like distance is the outcome of a very long and very honest education in what disclosure costs. Sit with the reality that his silence is not a wall he built against you. It is a protection he built around himself, and that he built it because he needed it, and that it has served him, and that it deserves more than your impatience. And if you want to reach him, if you genuinely want to be someone he can one day trust with the interior, then stop trying to get in. Start proving, slowly and consistently, and without agenda, that the outside is finally safe enough to make the inside less necessary. That is the work. It is not fast. It is not dramatic. It doesn't make for a good scene. But it is real. And so is he. And so is everything he has been carrying in silence for longer than you know. If this video gave you something real, a new lens, a shift in understanding, a different way of seeing someone you love, leave a comment below. Tell me whether you're the man this described or the person who loves him. Both voices matter here. And share this with someone who needs to hear it, because the algorithm will bury it if you don't.